Hi, and welcome to the My Creative Life blog. Today I wanted to kind of talk about embossing. Obviously, this week we are working with cut and emboss dies. These are some of the dies that I am working with. And obviously one of the things that you can do with these dies besides cut and emboss with them is to also cut and stencil with them is to also emboss with them. So I kind of wanted to talk about how to get a really good deep emboss rather than a really light emboss. So I wanted to show you some samples of some things that you can do to get a deeper emboss because let's be honest, an embossing folder gets a far better emboss than these dies. And part of that reason is they're just so thin, it's really hard to get much of an emboss there. So how can we improve it? So let me show you some examples. So, and I'll hold them up to the camera so hopefully you can see. This one is just barely embossed. And this one is done basically just by cutting this and using the two rubber mats that come with are specifically for Spellbinders to do the embossing, and that's it, nothing else. And I use a Big Shot, so you might get different results with a different machine, but typically it's not a very heavy emboss. So this one here, I want to show you this one. It's the same process, only I've shimmed up my machine with some cardstock. Basically, I take a piece of cardstock and fold it into thirds, so it's 3 layers of cardstock. Then I run through the machine with the embossing mats. So it's the die, the embossing mats, the shim, and then the cutting plate on top, and I run it through. So we get a little bit better emboss. This next one, and you'll see this is even a deeper emboss there. And I'm using white because typically white shows up the best when we emboss versus a color. So this one is actually done, what I've done is the process from the second one with the shim, but I've also made the paper just slightly damp, and I'll show you how I do that in a minute. Not a lot of water, just a little. And then you can see the emboss is much better, but we want to take it a step further. So I have one last scrap of cardstock. I have my die. In addition to that, I have a little water, and then I have something you may or may not have in your stash. We don't use them all that often anymore. This is called the stylus. It was you use this generally speaking when people emboss using embossing plates or templates. And you would use it with a light box, and that's how you would emboss. Well, of course, hardly anyone does it that way anymore. I'm sure there are people who do still use embossing plates or embossing templates, but I'm going to use it with the die, as well as I have a thick foam mat. You could use a thinner one, but I'm going to show you why this is important in a moment. So you could use a piece of fun foam, that would probably work too. This I use with some of my stamps to help get a good image, because it'll stamp into it gives some give to the paper versus putting it on a hard surface. So that's why I have this and keep it around, but we're also going to use it today. So we want to get our paper just slightly damp. You don't need to get it saturated. So basically what I do is, instead of spraying directly on it, I spray to the side so that the water just gently falls down, and you want to do it on both sides, otherwise your paper's gonna curl. And I just kind of wipe off any extras. If I can't feel any dampness, then I'm probably going to put a little extra on. But it's not very wet. It's just slightly, barely damp. If you get it too wet, the paper will break when you run it through. Rip or tear would be another way to say that. So I'm going to run this through. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. I've cut and embossed it with the shim. Now you might wonder, you might be thinking, well, why didn't she just use the sample that I've already used? Well, I could have, but then you wouldn't have gotten to see me spritz it with water. And I want it to be slightly still, just a little, almost like it's sat out in the humidity, which would be pretty easy to do here in Houston. So I want it still slightly damp when I'm doing the final step of my embossing. Now, typically a stylus has two different ends. One is in size, and I like to, generally speaking, use the smaller size. And let's bring you in just a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing here. There's two different ways that you can hold your pen, kind of tilt it in, but that's not, I actually like to tilt it almost outwards and run it across where that groove is. That's how I like to do it. Now if you slip, don't worry about it. It won't show up on the other side. So I like to hook that little ball on the edge of my die and just run it around. And I'm going a little slower than I normally would. If I was just whipping this out. See, I slipped there and you're never going to see it on the other side. You use the foam so that you can really depress into the foam. If you were using a hard surface, you wouldn't get quite as good of emboss. And you can go around it a couple of times if you want to. Get a nice deep emboss. Now we're going to pop that out. And you can see the difference. Much deeper. Now, when I use the stylus, the emboss is a bit more rounded than it is when I'm just using the machine, but it really stands out. So let's put a little ink on here so you can really see the edge then. So if you've ever wondered, how they get such a deep emboss in a project, this is some of the things that they do. The shim, the stylus, the water, all of them help in a slightly different way. So that is basically the finished product there. So I just highlighted it a bit so you can actually see the emboss really well. So those are some tips for getting a deep emboss. I have included my projects in this post on the blog, so you can see all the things I did with my cut and emboss dies. And then you can sign up for our newsletter. On Monday, I'll be sending out a process video that will show you how I made this fun little die cut. So we're going to do, in the process video, we're going to do multiple types of embossing, not just the dry emboss, but I also did a little regular heat or embossing powder on this as well. So lots of fun ideas for the Monday video. So if you have any questions about anything I did, be sure to let us know. And next week is Thanksgiving, so we'll be taking the week off and we'll be back the first week of December for more challenges.